This is a video about Steve Weiss, or Stephen Weiss, who was a military intelligence officer at the Dallas office at the time of the JFK assassination. You might need to watch my last video, my video about James Powell and Robert Jackson, to get the full context here, because I'm not going to go over all of that again, but I'm going to go over some of that. As I covered in my last video, the ARRB interviewed Edward Coyle, who was another officer at the intelligence office. And in that interview, he said this, and all of a sudden the radio went blank, and it stayed blank for quite a while, and we didn't know what the hell had happened. And our telephone rang, and I can remember Steve Weiss picking up the telephone, and one of our agents was in the school book depository building. That's James Powell. And he said that the president had been shot. And Steve Weiss liked to went berserk. Now, he was not questioned to determine what he means by Steve Weiss going berserk, but apparently Steve Weiss had a very strong reaction to Powell telling him that the president had been shot. Stronger than Coyle, or Coyle would have said something like, "We all went berserk." But it was Steve Weiss who went berserk. So I think Steve Weiss is special here. As I concluded with Powell, I think Steve Weiss probably was a tool of the conspiracy, but he was not expecting the president to be shot. And when he found out the president had been shot, he went berserk, because he said, "Oh my God, this is what they were doing," or something like that in his own mind. So that's why I find that significant. And in the second ARRB interview with Coyle, Coyle said the same thing about Steve Weiss going berserk. And Coyle also says here that he and Steve Weiss went and got a camera and loaded it with film because Powell had asked for a camera, and that they both ran down to the Texas School Book Depository building. And as I said in my last video, the reason Powell asked for a camera was because he wanted to be able to say he had a camera in his hands, not a walkie-talkie, because a walkie-talkie might imply he had something to do with the killing of the president. So he wanted to have a camera in his hands. So James Powell, after the assassination, is creating an alibi for himself by getting hold of a camera that he can be photographed with. And I think Steve Weiss is aware of Powell's activities, and he understands, or comes to understand, that this camera thing is to help create an alibi for Powell. So if Edward Coyle is a reliable witness, and I think he is, that means that Steve Weiss ran down to the Texas School Book Depository, and he was with Powell while Powell was creating his alibi. And I think this is probably Steve Weiss we see in this film that shows Powell with a camera. Because this person, Steve Weiss, seems to be arguing with the Dallas police about how his subordinate, James Powell, is being treated regarding the witness Howard Brennan. But Powell had told the ARRB that Powell had done this. I went back to the book depository building, and I went inside to use the phone to call my office and tell them what had happened. I went in there, made one phone call, came back out. There was a gentleman standing there who claims to have seen shots fired from a window above, and I talked to him briefly. But then another policeman came up. He looked like a fairly high-ranking policeman. He got out of a car, like a chief or whatever, and literally took the guy away from me. I told him I was interviewing him, showed him my credentials, but he had authority which superseded mine because this was his town, so he took the man before I even had a chance to get his name. So in Powell's story, Weiss cannot already be at the Texas School Book Depository because this is before Powell had called his office the second time, and Weiss was still at the office when Powell called the second time. So Powell tells the story as if Weiss isn't there, and as if he was objecting to the police taking his witness away. But when we watch the film, Powell never apparently says anything to the police. It's this other guy, who I think is Steve Weiss, who says that to the police. But Powell can't put that in his story because Weiss can't be there yet. In fact, Powell's story doesn't include Weiss at all. But even if he had wanted to include Weiss, he couldn't, because Weiss couldn't be there yet because he had not yet called the office in his story, if you can follow along with that. But the point here is that Powell is lying about Weiss, and that Weiss apparently is helping to support Powell's alibi in real time, even though he can't do so afterwards. And this is from another film showing the same scene. It shows Weiss a little better, the guy I say is Weiss. And you can see in this first frame that I'm starting at, Weiss is already got his mouth open. It looks like he's talking very loudly there at the police as they are taking Howard Brennan away. So I think this demonstrates that Weiss was acting in concert with Powell, as if he was supporting his subordinate there, and that it is Weiss who objects to the police about taking the witness away, if we are to believe this staged scene at all. It's not Powell who does that in the film. It's Powell who does that in his ARRB story. Of course, Powell didn't do that in his first story, but I don't want to go through all that in this video. The point here is that Weiss really was there with Powell after Powell had been released from the building, and they were staging this interview with Brennan to support Powell's story, even though Powell's original story had him interviewing Brennan inside the building, not outside. But they have to do it outside to get Powell photographed with the camera, and they want to pretend that this happened before he called the office. But that's why Weiss can't be there in the official story, because this is supposed to be before Powell had called his office. Apparently they were constructing this alibi in real time and didn't think it out completely. Weiss seems to be very aggressively involved here at first, but then backs down, I think. And I think he's probably just overacting a little bit because he knows he's acting out this scene with Powell. And I'll stop the frame here, oh, wait a minute. I'll stop the frame here, because that's just about the best picture we get of Weiss. He reminds me of Fletcher Prouty, but I don't think it's Fletcher Prouty. I was unable to find any photograph of this Steve Weiss, so I have nothing to compare it to verify my identification here. But I think it's probably Steve Weiss. I think that's what makes most sense with the evidence if you take the Coyle account as credible. Though I do think it's an interesting idea that might be Fletcher Prouty. We don't have any photographs of Weiss. And when he talked to the ARRB, it was only on the telephone. He never talked to them in person, so they never met him. And I don't know if Montague had ever heard Fletcher Prouty's voice at that time. I don't know. Maybe that's what Fletcher Prouty was up to. Anyway. Now, the ARRB did talk to Weiss. This was February 28th, 1997. This comes after the interviews with Powell and with Ed Coyle that were conducted by Timothy Ray. This interview, or this conversation, was not involving Timothy Ray, but a Dave Montague. So maybe it can be excused that Dave Montague doesn't know about the Powell situation. I don't know. You would think they would have reviewed that material before they contacted Weiss. To me, that seems to be the most important point regarding Weiss, so they talked about lots of other things with Weiss. But anyway, this is their first contact with Steve Weiss in February of 97. And it says, Weiss was cordial and said he's been retired from the government since 1982, but has something to tell us which he considers very important. I asked him to be more specific, and he said he won't specify over the phone, but we'll discuss it in person. He added that he was surprised that I'd interview anyone over the phone. I apologized for having to initially speak with him over the phone and explain the small structure resources with which we are working. Weiss understood and said he'll be happy to cooperate. Weiss said in circa 1982, approximately 3 weeks prior to his retirement, he was an intelligence oversight officer, another name for inspector general. He attended a meeting at which some high-level personnel showed him some material which he said, "It scared the shit out of me." Weiss thinks they were just trying to get his reaction to the material as one of the guys, but they soon realized he was not very amused or happy about it and began pretending it never happened. I reminded Weiss of the independent nature of the review board and our desire to place everything at the National Archives for the American people. I then told him I'd like to discuss the 1982 event with senior staff here for a potential interview at his home. Weiss said the material does not relate specifically to the assassination itself, but does relate to the Warren Commission and dossiers. Weiss said, "It devastated me for many years. I lived pretty straight and knew government people should not have done what they did." The conversation then switched to Weiss's knowledge of events surrounding the assassination, of which he made the following statements. He was a first lieutenant assigned to the 112th in Dallas during 1963. Prior to JFK's Dallas trip, his office received word from Colonel Robert E. Jones, who ordered them to offer full cooperation to the Secret Service in preparation for JFK's visit to Dallas. An agent in charge, named possibly Sauer of Secret Service, that's probably for Sorrels, allegedly said, "No, we don't need any assistance from anyone. Both us and the Texas Department of Public Safety will handle everything." His group, which he said included people like Major James E. Cloud, was surprised to hear that they, the Secret Service, had everything under control. The 112th had not done any special training with the Secret Service, but did have weapons, and he feels they could have been of some help. Since his unit wasn't helping that day, he decided to walk down in front of a hotel named either the Baker or the Adolphus to watch the motorcade. After it passed, he returned to his office and was with Colonel Tate, probably Colonel Pate, who just returned from Korea. They heard sirens, and the secretary ran in saying JFK had been shot. Then they really didn't hear too much over the radio for a few moments. And he mentions nothing about the call from Powell. A little later, Don Stringfellow, who worked for Lieutenant Reville of the Dallas Police Intelligence Unit, called and asked, "Do you got anything on a guy named Harvey?" Weiss checked the files and found nothing and hung up the phone. About 45 minutes later, Stringfellow called again and asked, "How about checking for anything on a Lee Harvey, Oswald?" Weiss asked if LHO killed JFK, and Stringfellow replied, "No, but he's a cop killer." He recalled Ed Coyle of his group went to a meeting before the assassination to talk with James Hosty of the FBI and a guy from ATF regarding a gun-running case. He feels we should know that another person from the unit named James Powell was on the steps of the TSBD and took pictures, but he didn't recall of what. I reviewed this information with Weiss for accuracy, verified his address, and thanked him for his time. I also told him I'd send him some explanatory material. So Weiss does mention Powell as having been at the Texas School Book Depository and as having taken pictures, but he says nothing about the phone call related to us by Edward Coyle, and of course he says nothing about he himself going to the Texas School Book Depository building. And then just a few days later, on March 10th, 1997, Douglas Horn called Steve Weiss in order to set up an in-person interview, but he decided he didn't want to talk anymore. I explained to Mr. Weiss that I was calling about a follow-up to Mr. Montague's telephonic contact interview of February 28th, 1997. I told him that my supervisor and I would be in Texas next week, and that we would be in Houston on March 21st, and that we would like to meet with him on the morning of March 21st, if at all possible. As a follow-up on the matter he was reticent to discuss with Mr. Montague, and this is that thing that happened in 1982 that's so mysterious. He politely but firmly declined to discuss the matter any further. He said he had given it considerable thought since his telephone conversation with Mr. Montague, and had decided not to discuss it any further, even in person. He said that as far as he was concerned, he was still on the Army payroll, and had decided that in spite of the fact that the ARRB employees have clearances, etc., that he thinks we should get this information from the Army and not from him. I repeated our availability to meet in person with him on the morning of March 21st in Houston, and asked him to call me collect if he were to change his mind about meeting with us. And the note here says, Weiss told to keep his mouth shut. I don't know who wrote that. I got this from the Malcolm Blunt archives, I believe. So maybe Malcolm Blunt wrote that. Anyway, a few days later, he changes his mind and doesn't want to talk about this big mysterious stuff he was shown in 1982. And then 3 days later, on March 13th, Jeremy Gunn wrote Steve Weiss a letter offering him assurances that he could speak freely. We are prepared to handle this matter in any way you deem appropriate. If you consent to my giving Mr. Alley your name and address, he is willing to write to you directly or to have someone from the Pentagon contact you. Or, if you prefer, I could forward to you a to whom it may concern letter from Mr. Alley. To the extent that any of your concerns pertain to secrecy or agreements or to a pension, Mr. Alley is willing to provide the assurance you need. Please give me a call to let me know your feelings on this matter. So far as I know, Steve Weiss never responded to this letter. There's nothing else in the record that I've been able to find. So apparently Steve Weiss decided not to talk. So I think this juicy morsel that Weiss dangled before the ARRB about something that happened in 1982, I think this might be some kind of diversionary information. That is, this is nothing at all. This is a made-up story, and the idea is to make Steve Weiss significant for this rather than for what he really did in 1963. And that's just the sort of thing that Fletcher Prouty would have done. But enough of that. And just to illustrate the diversionary effect of this is a post from the Education Forum. The most prominent reference I found to Steve Weiss, and it is a reference to this mysterious thing that supposedly happened in 1982. And that seems to be what people want to talk about when they talk about Steve Weiss. They don't seem to want to talk about him getting a camera down to Jim Powell at the Texas School Book Depository. They would rather talk about this thing we know nothing about, which is typical of shills and idiots, though I don't know anything about this particular poster here, so I wouldn't dream of calling him a shill or an idiot. But this diversionary effect is just the sort of thing I think Fletcher Prouty would enjoy. But enough of that. And I think it's very notable that Steve Weiss mentions Don Stringfellow of the Dallas Police Department. That's very interesting because nobody ever mentions Don Stringfellow. In fact, the only other reference to Don Stringfellow in the evidence is one of those bizarre internal Army intelligence reports, or it's a spot report. It's a cable, I believe, sent from, well, I guess they don't know precisely where it was sent from, but I think probably from the Dallas office, because that's the only other mention of Don Stringfellow we get, and the information would have had to come from there if they're talking to the Dallas police. So I think the implication here is that Steve Weiss, or whoever, is an important assassination conspiracy figure. He's a kind of like a point man and he's in the Dallas Office of Army Intelligence. And the spot report says, Assistant Chief Don Stringfellow, Intelligence Section, Dallas Police Department, notified Region 2 that Oswald had confessed to the shooting of President Kennedy and police officer Tibbetts. The only additional information they have obtained from Oswald at this time is that he defected to Cuba in 1959, and that he is a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. Chief Lumpkin of the Dallas Police Department requested Region 2 assist then in obtaining a Russian linguist. Chief Lumpkin did not say that the subject's wife was in custody of police, but it is known that subject is married to a Russian girl. Through reserve officer contacts of Region 2, a Russian linguist was obtained. The linguist is redacted, an employee of an oil company in Dallas. It is not known if redacted is presently at Dallas Police Station. No record files, headquarters 112th, INTC, of Mamatov, or Mamontov. That's the Russian linguist. Weirdly, although his name is redacted twice here, in this last sentence, his name is not redacted. And of course, the official story is that Oswald never confessed to shooting anybody, that he defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, not to Cuba, and that he wasn't actually a member of the Communist Party. So this is a very erroneous information, according to the official story, though it does suggest possibilities for a Harvey and Lee scenario, which I have entertained. But I don't want to get into that here. The point here is about Steve Weiss. I think probably he is the source of this information, and to me it sounds like Prouty somehow, though I can't prove that. But enough of that. And this is the other bizarro Army intelligence communication that probably comes from the Dallas office of the 112th, though it doesn't mention Stringfellow. The following related to Special Agents West and Lanyon, Region 2, by Captain Dowdy, Dallas Police. Subject's wife has signed a statement stating that subject owned the rifle, which is believed to be the weapon that fired the shot that killed President Kennedy and wounded Governor Connally. This info has not been released to the public. The rifle was manufactured in Italy in 1940. The police have interviewed a witness who has stated that a man fitting subject's description in company of another man were observed by this witness on 20 November 1963 in the immediate vicinity of the place where President Kennedy was killed. These men were observed sighting in a rifle at two silhouette targets. When the police arrived on the scene, they realized they were in the direct line of sight, so attempted to approach the men by circling around to their rear. When the two officers arrived at the spot where the men were last observed, the men had disappeared. The witness further stated that he saw an old model car parked in the vicinity of where the two men were observed with the rifle. The description of the car fits the description of the car that the subject was driving. The subject is Oswald. Witness believes there was a man sitting in the car. This info has not been released to the public. It still hasn't been released to the public. The slugs that killed President Kennedy and wounded Governor Connally have not been recovered. Now, the way I envision this is that we've got these two people sighting the rifle up on the overpass where the throat shot came from. And this will be an important shot, as I've gone over in other videos. And so they might want to sight the distance so that they can aim the rifle more accurately. And so you might have Oswald and somebody else up there. I don't think Oswald shot from the overpass. but I think someone else did. And so they might want to sight in the distance for where they're going to be shooting to, and you would have silhouette targets down on Elm Street or on the side of Elm Street or something, right near where they plan to be shooting Kennedy. That's the way I envisioned this, but there is no corroboration of this report from the Dallas police, who should have a record of this if it really happened. Anyway, this, it seems to me, comes from the same source as the other thing, and there seems to be at least one missing communication in between the two that I've shown here. And there are others, of course, that we don't have. Somehow we still have these two. And I think they probably came from the same source. And it looks to me like it was probably Steve Weiss or whoever that is.